One thing that I always loved to do when I would go to the beach as a kid was play in the sand. And hopefully this is relatable to many of you, but in particular, I loved digging holes in the sand. And the goal was always to try to dig as big of a hole in the sand as possible for my siblings and me to play in, or build sandcastles, or just fill with water. And if you ever did this as a kid, you know how challenging this is, because at the beach, you don't have to dig very deep before water starts coming up out of the sand. This water then quickly erodes the sides and walls, causing the sides to collapse, but this only adds to the excitement because it's like you're racing against time to keep the water at bay and keep your sand hole or your castle from collapsing. Now, although this is something that I thoroughly enjoyed as a kid, I'm also now aware of just how dangerous this is in the right circumstances. In 2017, an 18-year-old brother and 17-year-old sister were visiting Toms River, New Jersey, which is a coastal city of about 100,000 people. And despite it being in New Jersey, there are actually several beautiful white sand beaches along the coast. That day, they were there for a nice family outing, just hanging out in the sun and spending some time on the beach. And although they were in their late teens, they were passing the time by digging a great big hole in the sand. Unlike me when I was a kid, they weren't just using their hands to dig this hole, they were using a frisbee to dig more efficiently. This meant that within just a little while, they managed to dig a massive 10-foot hole in the ground. Immensely proud of this, the two of them still weren't satisfied with how large it had gotten, so the brother hopped into the hole and continued digging even deeper. Unfortunately, sand is a little bit different than regular dirt. Because it's more rounded and smooth, sand particles are actually a bit more like little marbles. Under normal circumstances, these don't stick together all that well. But when you're at the beach, the reason you can make sandcastles is because of the moisture that's in the sand. This helps the sand stick together and be shaped in all sorts of ways. As the sand then dries out, the tendency to stay together decreases and reduces its structural integrity. This means that it's more easily disturbed by people walking around, by vibrations in the crowd, and even just by its own weight. So at some point, as the brother was digging in this 10-foot pit, the hole collapsed on top of him, completely covering him in sand and partially covering his sister. People rushed over to help them out and dig them out as fast as they could, knowing that time was quickly running out. Just 1 cubic foot of sand weighs 100 pounds, meaning that just a relatively small amount of sand would weigh heavily on someone's chest. In addition to being crushed by the sand, being covered in it is completely suffocating. All the air would be completely removed from the hole, and even if there was a pocket to breathe, his chest would have been almost impossible to inflate because of the weight of the sand. So tragically, by the time he was finally uncovered, he had unfortunately already died of asphyxiation. His sister, thankfully, would be recovered with just minor injuries. This has to be one of the most tragic ways to go, simply because it can occur from doing such a seemingly innocent activity, like digging a hole in the sand. And unfortunately as well, these occur every couple of years, making them even more tragic. This next story also takes place in New Jersey, which, believe it or not, is actually home to a decent number of caves, and not just man-made caves like in the previous story. There are dozens of caves spread across the relatively small state that have formed in all different rock types and all sorts of geological processes. In March of 1982, a state police sergeant named Donald took the Boy Scout troop that he worked with to explore one of these caves. He was an avid spelunker and just recently thought that it would be a fun activity for the scout group to participate in as well. Since winter was over and they were finally getting some warmer weather, the group had gone the last few weekends to explore, and now, for the first time ever, both of his sons, who were also scout members, were old enough to come on one of these trips. You can just imagine how excited they must have been to finally go caving with their father. The cave they would be exploring is actually the longest in the state at around 1,250 feet, known as Crooked Swamp Cave. Unlike some of the other caves across the US, Crooked Swamp Cave is essentially just a narrow passage through limestone bedrock. About 2 miles northwest of the town of Lafayette, the cave is bordered by a swamp on one side. The water from the swamp in this area has slowly dissolved the passages over thousands of years, which were then discovered by people and named. As you might imagine, this is not one of those grand limestone caverns that is filled with massive smooth chambers. This is one of those dirty, muddy, crawl-on-your-stomach type caves. In fact, some of the tunnels are so small that it was once thought to be 3 separate caves. It was only later that spelunkers realized that some of these tiny tunnels were actually connected together. On Saturday, Donald, 18 scouts, and a few other scoutmasters entered the cave and started exploring at around 2 p.m. After entering the cave, the scoutmasters carefully led the scouts through some of the chambers and even some of the tighter squeezes. One of these is known as the 5-foot high room and is only accessible by very thin individuals because the side passage that leads to it is a seriously narrow squeeze. But at 5'11", 160 pounds, Donald could make it, and with the scouts mostly being teenagers, this wasn't much of an issue. The cavers moved out of that room shortly after because it's also known to have an unstable roof, which could technically collapse at any second. Part of the way through their trip, Donald entered an uncharted area that required him to crawl along his stomach through a long, narrow tunnel. He kept crawling through this tunnel, scooting his body along until it started winding downward at about a 30-degree angle. Now about 15 feet underground and about 75 feet from the entrance, all of a sudden, Donald slipped and slid all the way down to the end of a 16-foot drop. In the fall, he was completely wedged in the tiny tunnel with his arms pinned underneath him, in a position that is eerily reminiscent of John Jones in Nutty Buddy Cave. Immediately, Donald knew he was very stuck. He had forcefully slid into the spot, which wedged him much farther than he could have gotten just by crawling. And because he had no time to stop himself, his arms got trapped in a weird position that prevented him from having any leverage to push himself back. In the little 18-inch by 20-inch tunnel, Donald was wedged almost like a cork. Shortly after realizing he was very stuck, he called back to the others and explained the situation, but because of how far down he'd fallen, it was a challenge for anyone to even reach him, let alone pull him out. His two sons and one of the scoutmasters tried unsuccessfully for about an hour to pull him out before realizing that they'd need to call for help. By then, all of the other scouts had already left with the other scoutmasters, so the remaining three finally alerted authorities about the situation. When rescuers arrived, they got into the tunnel and talked with Donald, who at this point was still in good spirits. He joked with them and even asked them to tell his wife that he'd be home later that day. But an often underrated factor in cave fatalities is the cold. In the last century of spelunking, cavers have developed different clothing and layering to combat this, but much of this improvement has come only recently. In early spring in New Jersey, it's still relatively cold outside. Inside the cave, the temperature was just 57 Fahrenheit, or 13 degrees Celsius, meaning that in addition to blood pooling in his head, because of the angle he was at, Donald got very cold. After the first rescuers realized how badly he was stuck, word was sent out to cave rescue organizations all across the country. In no time, rescuers were being flown from all over to get Donald out as quickly as possible. Soon, there were 150 individuals on the scene around the entrance, using a variety of different tools to try to pull him out. They used chisels and drills to widen the tunnels and ropes and pulleys attached to his feet, but unfortunately, they were only able to move him just a few inches before he slid back into place. In the fall, a rock had gotten wedged right near his hips. As they pulled, the rock would roll and eventually wedge itself, preventing him from being moved any further. By that evening, Donald was still fully coherent and communicated with rescuers, but as the night wore on, it was clear that Donald was starting to suffer from hypothermia. He was occasionally able to get out a few words, but started to drift in and out of consciousness. Then at around 2 a.m. on Sunday, now 12 hours since entering the cave, Donald made a few last grunts and then stopped making noise entirely. At the same time, two sisters arrived from Pittsburgh who were members of the Cave Rescue Commission and were specifically known for their ability to access the tiniest passages. In their early 20s, one of the sisters was just 5'2" and 105 pounds, and the other was just 5 feet tall and 86 pounds. Not only were they cavers themselves, but because of their petite stature, they'd often been called on these special rescues where the situation demanded individuals of their size. More importantly though, although maybe it wasn't entirely comfortable for them to be in such tiny spaces, they were able to keep calm and collected despite the circumstances. The two sisters took turns going into the tunnel where Donald was, but were still unable to reach his head because of how narrow it was. The farthest they were able to reach were his feet, where they checked for a pulse and found nothing. And although this was concerning, he was also very cold. When you're hypothermic, blood is diverted to vital organs, which can weaken the pulse in your extremities. So to keep him warm, hot packs were placed around his body, and the cave was even pumped full of warm air to keep him alive. Rescuers worked desperately to get Donald out, but by the following morning, hope was starting to wane. A nurse was sent down around 6 a.m. and managed to get all the way to his feet. She was able to check his pulse at his foot, behind his knee, and then with an electrocardiogram, but by then, no pulse was detected. Upon realizing that Donald was now on the verge of death, a new plan was put in place to dig straight down to him. An 18-inch hole in the ground would be dug, and then one person would be lowered down in a small cage to chisel out the rock around where he was stuck. It would take until the afternoon on Sunday to get deep enough, but then it would take all the way into the following day on Monday to drill sideways to reach him. The bedrock and the angle and the space they were working with just made it an incredibly difficult and time-consuming task. When they finally reached him, despite their best efforts, they were only able to move him an additional foot. It was at this point that Donald was officially pronounced dead. Following this announcement, a full demolition of the hillside commenced using dynamite and heavy machinery. Then, after 80 hours trapped underground, Donald's body was finally recovered from Crooked Swamp Cave. It was determined that due to hypothermia, first he had passed out, then he went into shock, and finally he ultimately died of cardiac arrest. His body temperature was a full 20 degrees lower than normal upon recovery. And since the incident, access to Crooked Swamp Cave has been restricted to only individuals with explicit permission. It's often assumed that cave diving is an activity that's only undertaken by risk takers. At face value, it seems like a risky activity, and therefore, of course, people doing it must have a tendency to engage in risky behavior. But if there's one thing that I've learned about cave diving over the course of making all these videos, it's the fact that for the most part, cave divers are not risk takers. Now, this might be due to survivorship bias, but to me it seems most of these individuals tend to be calm and highly analytical. At least those who have long careers, and especially those who choose to do deep, technical dives. The amount of math, chemistry, and physics involved in planning out these dives is something that is super underappreciated and stuff I generally leave out. This is mostly because including this stuff would complicate sometimes already confusing stories, and even if I did want to include them, I don't have the aptitude to make sure I'd be giving you the correct information. But even if these concepts are hard to understand, they are often the difference between life and death in cave diving. So a word of caution, if you can't squash that propensity for risk-taking, cave diving is probably not for you. Born in 1958 in Wrocław, Poland, Władek Szymanowski discovered caves and spelunking towards the end of high school. Then when he got into university and saw that they offered courses where he could actually go explore some caves, he signed up right away. And thankfully, not only was Władek a super happy and optimistic person, he was one of those people who was just good at anything he tried. Using humor, he could diffuse any social conflict, and because of how quickly he learned everything, anything he started, he quickly became an expert. In fact, he was actually one of the first stockbrokers in all of Poland, which was a profession that he became highly successful at. In addition to his love for caving, he was also an avid climber with experience in the Tatra ranges in Poland, the Dolomites in Italy, and the Swiss and French Alps. And as he made trips across Europe, he would find caves wherever he went, so by the time the 2000s rolled around, he had been caving all across the continent. Around this time as well, cave diving started to get more popular, and he watched as many of his contemporaries switch from dry caving to underwater caving. Władek had also always wanted to get into diving, so as the industry shifted that way, he figured it was time for him to take that step as well. Naturally, Władek started with some beginner workshops, but because of his caving experience and his natural talents, he was quickly one of the leading divers in Poland. Following the death of another of Poland's premier divers, Władek inadvertently took on the title of the most active cave diver in the country. Then, in April of 2005, he went to France on another one of his normal trips, this time to explore some of the unique flooded systems in a town called Bourg-Saint-Andéol. And these truly are some unique systems. The town itself is only about 7,000 people with a large river running through its east side, but because of the age of the town, all of the buildings are these old stone constructions. Some of the roads are cobblestone, and the entire area is nestled into rolling, rocky hills. In the middle of all of this is a small, unassuming park and two small, equally unassuming caves. One of these is underneath a railway bridge and almost looks like the opening of a well, and the other is like a small grotto cut into a cliffside. What you can't see from the surface is that these are actually massive underwater cave systems. The larger of the two, Goules de Tenerife, is over 1 kilometer long and at least 210 meters, or close to 700 feet deep. The other one, Goules du Pont, is almost the same depth but just not quite as long. And not only are these caves massive, but they're also filled with crystal clear water and beautifully colored limestone tunnels. In contrast to the last story, these are those picturesque caves that you imagine when you think of cave diving. So rather than just do one of these caves, Władek planned to do both of them over a 2-day period, because as the saying goes, if a little is good, more is better. Then, one morning in April, Władek slipped on all of his equipment in the cobblestone parking lot of the park and prepared to enter one of these unassuming ponds. For this dive, he wouldn't actually be going all that deep. This was going to be Goules de Tenerife, which is interestingly shaped because it extends horizontally for over 2,000 feet at less than 30 feet of depth before finally getting deeper. After that initial horizontal tunnel though, it quickly winds its way down to that massive 700-foot depth. One particular section is a 300-foot shaft that descends almost vertically into the earth. But given the length of that initial horizontal section, it's kind of impractical to get very deep because of just how much gas you have to carry with you. The deep dive that he intended to do would be reserved for the following day in the other cave. After finishing up that day and testing out all of his equipment, Władek and his team returned to their hotels and got a good night's rest for his record-breaking dive the following day. This dive was going to be a special dive because Władek intended to smash his own depth record and push it to almost 400 feet. Goules du Pont was perfect for this because it descends rapidly without much extra horizontal distance. This meant he could limit his time in the water while also extending his depth record in this beautiful cave. Then, the following morning at 9 a.m., he and his team were back at the pond getting all of his equipment ready. For this dive, he'd be using his equipment of choice, which was a rebreather, and then 2 backup gas cylinders, one with air for the shallower sections and one trimix for the deeper sections. A rebreather is more complicated than a traditional system, but it offers some advantages, like being able to stay underwater for longer. On the other hand, rebreathers are more expensive and more complicated, but that's also exactly what Władek loved. He'd often opt for more complicated equipment even if simpler stuff was available, just because he liked to tinker around with it. Finally, he performed his long rebreather pre-checklist to make sure everything was working correctly. A few pictures were taken of him on the surface, and then he dipped his head under the water. Between the rebreather and additional cylinders, Władek was bulkier than his idea for caves, but that wouldn't be much of an issue in Goules du Pont except for one tight squeeze at the mouth of the cave. Now, out of all the stories I've covered, it wasn't until this one that I fully appreciated just how complicated, deep, technical rebreather diving is. As you move through the water-filled passages, you have to monitor the oxygen level of your breathing gas and adjust it according to the depth you're at to equalize the pressure. The same thing goes for your dry suit and your buoyancy control device. You also have to monitor the pressure of your cylinders and keep track of the readings on your dive computer. You also have to watch how quickly you're descending and how long you've been underwater. Even just adding air to your buoyancy device is not straightforward. As you go deeper, the air compresses and becomes less buoyant, meaning that the amount of air needed for the same buoyancy at different depths is different. Then on the way up, the inverse is true, and you have to do all of this in a maze of pitch-black tunnels, ensuring you don't bump into anything and kick up silt, or you'll essentially blind yourself. As you might imagine, keeping track of all of this requires a lot of concentration, even with a clear head. If your head isn't clear and you make a mistake, things can go seriously wrong very quickly. At around 10 a.m., Władek traveled from the surface diagonally down to the first and only restriction at around 35 feet. He carefully squeezed his tanks and equipment through, being mindful not to disturb the silt. From the initial drop, the cave levels out a bit and extends another 165 feet almost horizontally. At the end of this tunnel, there's an abrupt drop down a 30-foot vertical shaft. After getting to the opening, Lodic maneuvered his body in such a way that allowed him to stay horizontal as he descended. This was crucial using the type of equipment that he was using. At the bottom of the shaft, now about 100 feet down, the cave descends further in a series of steep diagonal steps down to 215 feet. This is around when Lodic's issues would have started. To combat the narcotic effect of different gases at depth, divers breathe a mixture of gases different than regular air. This narcotic effect is almost like being drunk or very tired, but in either case, it impairs your judgment and reflexes. The trimix of gases that deep divers use mitigates this to a degree, but there can still be some effect anyway. Some people have a weird resistance to narcosis, while others are very sensitive to it, and this effect will even vary from day to day in the same person. Now getting down to below 200 feet, Lodic likely noticed that this narcotic effect was particularly bad that day. But just 140 vertical feet from his depth record and highly experienced, he probably assumed that it was just one of those days and continued onward. It's also possible that at this point in his dive, he was already significantly impaired. At 260 feet of depth, the steep steps stop and then there's another short horizontal passage. And although Lodic's thoughts were increasingly impaired, he was so close to the end that he couldn't just stop. There was just one last drop and then he would come back up. Unfortunately, this would be his final, crucial mistake. In fact, Lodic should have never entered the water that day. Long before he even entered the water, he had made a mistake that doomed this attempt right from the start. The trimix divers use is a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen in different ratios for different depths. This has to be correct and relatively precise. With too much oxygen, you get oxygen toxicity. Too little, you get hypoxia, and so on and so on. Somehow, Lodic had mixed the wrong gases or grabbed the wrong tank and never tested the mixture he was using. The narcotic effect he was feeling wasn't unusually strong that day because of a bad day. It was unusually strong because he was breathing in way too much of the wrong gas mixture. Then he swam over the edge of the final 100-foot vertical shaft and started his descent. Carefully watching his descent rate, oxygen, pressure, and everything else, Lodic started to make mistakes. As he descended, his foggy brain prevented him from understanding exactly what was going on. Halfway through the vertical shaft, his breathing was labored because he wasn't equalizing the pressure properly. He continued descending rapidly and finally impacted the bottom, now at 360 feet of depth. Barely being able to breathe, he struggled to switch the circuit to the spare cylinder on his rebreather. This would have given him the crucial minute he needed to switch over to his backup trimix. Finally, he got it and started breathing again, but by then, he was either too impaired or semi-conscious, and then the mouthpiece dropped out of his mouth and he began to inhale water. At 3 p.m., the surface team knew something was wrong. This was their pre-planned time to indicate that he might need some help. They made 2 attempts at a rescue down to a depth of 230 feet, but at this depth, Lodic was still far out of reach. Following these attempts, they knew that Lodic had died somewhere in the depths of Goulet du Pont. Then the following day, his body was recovered from the bottom of a vertical shaft at a depth of 360 feet with his mouthpiece out of his mouth and 2 full backup cylinders. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out the other videos in the series. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.